feels like I've been doing this for a while, but I've really only been doing this since. Let me start a timer too, so I don't run too long. Really only been doing this since October, and before that, I was leading a team that I think is best described as a post-factor venture studio. We spun out a bunch of teams, and I went to create a nonprofit that was working on kind of near-term applications of what was the open agency architecture from Davidad is now safeguarded AI. And my primary concern, I would say, is really that uh, AI architectures today give you proposals for how you could change systems, and those changes could benefit systems, or they could be to the detriment of systems, because most of these either require a user to then do the review, or they pass the burden of review on to someone else in the system in which these AI systems are behaving. You'll see these as four domains. They're intended to be representative, but not complete. All additionally of the challenge that good behavior for humans is hard to define, and it's a subjective moving target, and doing so for AI agents is arguably even harder because they share less context with humans. My biggest concern is that we will have financial incentives to deploy as many agents as possible as long as they're making money. And whether or not an agent is making money is not a very good metric for if it's doing what we want it to do. And so my claim is that what we should be doing is making tools to set rules that AI has to prove that it's obeying. The concept more generally of guaranteed safe AI has this like push that instead of having a monolithic AI system where you talk to it and you get something back, instead you should have a world model that is a component of this system, but that is separable and auditable. And you can specify goals and features of goals in terms of that world model, and that AI systems should propose actions and validate the impacts of those actions against these world models. This is something that multiple people have been talking about, but for the most part, I will claim this is primarily a research effort. And I'm wondering the extent to which, while these research efforts try to see if this is useful for addressing global safety risks, there are important things you'd ask, like how can you specify risk in a general context for any possible input or any possible like domain of impact? How do you have a world model that is sufficiently high fidelity that you have confidence it captures all the risks, even if it's doing so probabilistically? While researchers who are better suited to that work are solving those problems, I am trying to find I'm trying to find ways to solve user experience research or customer acquisition or product problems on the path to solving these problems, tech transfer really, that can be done usefully before the global overarching problems can be solved. I think that this is actually a way to potentially sidestep the question of alignment, in that really what this does is it scales governance over AI systems. I claim that instead of doing this with Copilot, where you get something that you then have to review yourself, we should have something that creates a spec, a solution, a proof, and verification that proof meets the spec. And each of those things should be interrogatable. One really nice property is that those things can be targets of governance. You can deliberate and you can decide whether you want to pass a particular spec, or you can generate a set of candidates and do a quadratic voting or sortition against one of those. So this has a property that is very nice compared to a lot of other review systems. I should briefly note that while you could claim that constitutional AI has this property, it does have, and I agree that it has the nice property that you can together set a constitution. You do kind of delegate the education or the adjudication of those constitutions to a language model that you then have to rely on to scale your review. And I would prefer having that in conjunction with a set of objective properties that you can get concrete quantitative guarantees around. My long-term goal is to have something like an international standards organization for verifiably governable AI. I think this is very ambitious, but I also think that it's really easy to imagine a future where there's maybe a UN peacekeeping force that is at the will of some set of citizens who are sortitioned to determine whether or not there are capabilities possibly showing up that might violate principles of some governance body that is a non-governmental governance body. So like weird mix of like, do you have control over all AI? If so, what does that look like? If so, how do you represent that? I think that there are things that you could have that look like standards bodies that could be less dystopian than others. Weak claim, because strong ones are hard there. Atlas Computing, my entity, is a nonprofit. We're very small, but we think it's very important to help anyone who wants to use this architecture. And so my hope is that we could be a collaborator or vendor or potential funder for providing this architecture and making sure everyone can use it, onboarding as many people as possible. I think I see the general workflow as picking a domain and saying, what risk does a lack of review of AI outputs create? Are there ways to specify what those risks are? Are there tools to encode the subjective preferences that people have into objective criteria? And then can you use those criteria to evaluate if those risks are becoming manifest? And can you generate strong evidence that a particular solution is or is not risky? As two examples, you could imagine one workflow where you go from natural language and a legacy code base to an updated, formally verified version of that code base for some critical cyber-physical infrastructure systems like the electrical grid or the water system. This is roughly the holy grail of, or this is a holy grail of formal verification. It's very ambitious, but it's worth noting that AlphaFold roughly solved the holy grail of protein folding. So I say emphasis on roughly there, but I think that we're at an age where you can start imagining capstone problems starting to be solved, and if so, I think we should really target which ones we're trying to solve. Another direction would be forecasting the toxicity of small molecules. I think that you could be given a small molecule and first use an AlphaFold analog. I'd like to set up a competition that has you create an AlphaFold analog that given a small molecule, you say, these are the reaction rates and binding energies with literally everything in the cell. I'm forecasting this, and then we can spot check that. And we can see how well the accuracy of those forecasts ends up being. From those, you can then predict the toxicity of this molecule. I think this is a perfect thing for organizing competition around. And once you have this, you also have a great tool for designing drugs that modify pathways without causing harmful effects. And importantly, you have a way to formalize what you mean objectively by what harmful effects are. And I think this is very important because this, as I said, is something that is subjective and time dependent and location specific. Ethanol to some people is okay. LSD to some people is not. And so our active efforts are around trying to push these two domains first, the formal methods one, the chemical or the small molecule toxicity forecasting, and then generally grow the team, try and build the ecosystem. We think that this is the best way to together achieve AI that we can put trust in. And so we want as many people to work with us as possible. And if you want these slides, this is the QR code for it. Happy to take questions.
Fascinating. The analysis of the problem. Oh, thank you. The analysis of the problem is fascinating and it was very well delivered. I worked on a pipeline that I want to make an informed consultation of AI system. When you showed the pipeline, that was for me great, but I want to share why it's not working really.
Love to hear.
Specifically between solution specification and solution generation, in order to give more control to people, you can return, 20 possible paths. That is expected that the person that was looking for an answer now has to evaluate 20 possible paths of something where he's not an expert. And in this case, you talk about something that is software, so it can be formally verified. But if I ask something that is about political, is about human complexity, is about nature, of course, I end up to not having the right solution, no? So I will try to restrict the domain of the problem. If it's about software or proteins, it's closed. If it's about politics, it's open.
Yeah, I definitely think that as you get farther, I think that on the spectrum from like things where we know how to specify them now to things where we have no idea how to specify them, that human language as a category is probably the farthest thing you can get to this end of the spectrum. Maybe images are all like general images are also there in terms of like the safety of ideas. The safety of physical systems, far easier. If you take cyber, you could even split it from like the operation of the electrical grid on the far left side in terms of like, it's very easy to get someone to express what safe operation is for like airplanes, I guess. Autopilot is like already, it's done. That's how we de facto evaluate safety. Whereas like operating systems and like user applications on the like hard to specify side, there's definitely a spectrum within each of these. And I totally agree that the extent to which you can scope the domain of impact, like scoping that down is what makes us able to do this type of product development now. If you want to do something more general, you really need to start looking at what these people are doing here. Particularly like this ARIA is specifically Davidad's program at ARIA. I think that these start looking at like what it would take to define and enforce safety properties in a general sense.
Last question.
So if we go back to your bio forecasting slide, even if we assume that your entire like solution spec, solution generator, solution checker like actually works, wouldn't the fact that the bioactivity forecast exists make any weights that you have that generate that toxicity forecaster, wouldn't that be an extremely valuable honeypot for any nation state with a bioweapons program? And if so, what would you want to do about that before you ever made that thing?
First thing is restrict this to small molecules, because it's really hard to create a small molecule bioweapon. I think chemical weapons are pretty much a solved problem in the open already. And like you're probably more limited. I don't think this is something where all of these like things are even allowed to be open source. It's a lot of the like, as I thought through, like we have a more in-depth proposal for this on our website, and there's a section on how to reduce risk proliferation from this, because my goal is very much each of these should be asymmetrically risk reducing. I think one of the things you have to do is, as you aggregate this data set, you set up legal guarantees and constraints around who has access to these. And the extent to which you seem, from your expression, to not trust legal guarantees, I think is both valid and also just a representation of the difficulty of restraining or trying to redirect progress generally. I would expect that I think a lot of anything related to the problem of risk is a socio-technical problem. And I think that there's two aspects of responsibility that comes on the side of the technical. And one is building things where in the right hands, they net reduce risks. And the other is doing everything you can to make sure that they are in the right hands. If there are things like, I'd be happy to talk to you afterward and find out if you think, I'm open to being convinced that we should not do this because it is net risky. And if if you convince me of that, we will scrap this and we will actively advocate against it. But I currently think at the moment that by restricting what you're training over, by restricting, by like adding legal restrictions on what can be done with this, that we could probably at least tie the current inertial systems of governance to ideally even making systems more constrained and more safe than if we didn't do this.
Great, thank you. We'll have to leave it at this, but you'll do a breakout hopefully, and so you can, there's lots to discuss and unpack. Thank you so much, Evan.